Hi folks, in this video I'm going to show you how I do these Red Desert Mad Max inspired bases that I use for my orcs. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. First of all, we're going to apply an even coat of Vallejo Desert Sand texture paint over the base. You don't necessarily have to use the Vallejo texture paint, but I do recommend that you use a light sandy coloured texture paint. And the reason for this is the technique that we're going to be using today is staining this to lend to the different reds and browns and yellows that you see in those Mad Max films. It's very important that this texture paint is 100% dry before we move on to the next step. The first colour we'll be using for our staining effect is Indian Shadow from Scale 75. Now I've thinned this down on my palette with a little bit more water than normal, as we're going to be applying this almost a bit more like a wash. And what I'm doing is I'm applying this to one area of the base, and the idea is to make it more intense in one area and feather it out. So once you put down some Indian Shadow, rinse off your brush, and with a damp brush go backwards and forwards over the edge of the paint and soften out the transition. We're going to be building this over a few layers to get a nice strong colour variation. The idea is to build up this effect over 3 or 4 passes. This is, I believe, pass number 3, and as you can see we've got almost a opaque Indian Shadow at one side, filtering out to a very translucent with our almost texture paint showing through at the other end, and this is what we are looking for. The next colour we'll be using is Orange Leather from Scale 75, and this is quite similar to Scalecolor Orange from Games Workshop. And with this we'll be using exactly the same technique as we did with the Indian Shadow, so we've thinned this down a little bit more than normal on our palette and applied it over the edge of our strongest area of the Indian Shadow. And then I'm rinsing my brush off and coming back with a wet brush and moving backwards and forwards over the edge of the orange leather and where the Indian Shadow is at its strongest, and going backwards and forth. Whilst the paint is still wet, this will really allow us to wet blend and soften up that transition. And don't worry if this isn't perfect. In fact, it looks even better if it isn't perfect. We're trying to emulate the natural look of different soils and dust and dirt. And just like with the Indian Shadow step, it is much better to do this in several thin down paint passes than trying to get this done all in one go. No right or wrong level of intensity of this colour, it is all down to personal taste, and you'll probably find that it looks a lot more natural if it's slightly different on each of the bases that you do. The last paint colour we'll be using for this transition is Screaming Skull from Games Workshop. Just like in the previous 2 steps, I've thinned this down quite heavily with water. And with this, I'm going to apply it to a section of the base, rinse my brush off, and then with the wet brush, feather this out into the orange leather from our previous step. And I do this a couple of times, just so you can build up the effect, rather than trying to do this all in one immediate pass. As an optional step, you can use some light bone or sandy coloured weathering powder, just dusted on with an old brush, to blend these two together and lead into a dusty wasteland feel. This is a completely optional step, but I think it really does help sell this whole post-apocalyptic vibe on these bases. The last thing to add to really sell this wasteland look is to add a small dead grass tuft. Here I've used a barren land tuft from Rival Craft Scenics. And with that, this base is now complete. If you like this tutorial, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, and you get further updates and tutorials just like this one. Till next time, folks.